Hello again, dear listener. I'd like to talk about a topic I've been thinking about a little bit lately, which is technocracy and democracy. Specifically, the concept that democracy is kind of being abandoned by all sides of the political spectrum as sort of an ideal or as a system. I've been reading a fair bit recently about by right-wing criticism of democracy. Your Republicans, your aristocratic um, and so on, criticism of democracy, the idea of mob rule, and so on. There isn't much in the way of literature that, from the left or the liberal side of things, that criticizes democracy really, because fundamentally democracy fits with their ideology. Empowering the masses, give the masses power, and they will obviously side with the left. That's the whole communist idea. Of course, Jonathan Bauer said this in the lecture quite famously. That one of the reasons that communism is so brutal is because it's disappointed in human nature. Because communism was invented as this ennobling of humanity, this idea that if humanity is unleashed from the shackles of property, in a sort of Rousseauian way, from the shackles of hierarchy, it will turn to absolute equality. And the truth is, of course, that that's not what humans are. There's biological facts, there's hormonal facts, there are simply unchangeable parts of being human. The difference between the sexes, the fact that we're tribal, the fact that we are quite egoistic, the fact that we will do others down in order to advance ourselves, that we are not always rational, these sorts of things, which you come to realize, of course, if you do anything in terms of politics and any reading about human history or nature. And the idea is that communists punish humanity. Well, yeah, humanity, I guess, is the right term, because they don't conform to their view of the world. And liberals have this similarly naive, optimistic view of humans. And that goes quite contrary to democracy, of course, because in order for democracy to work, you have to assume that every man is rational, every man is informed, and makes informed decisions when voting, and is informed about the parties and the issues, and knows what's happening in terms of as much as economics as geopolitics and so on. But this would require every man to be something of a universal genius, to be very rational, to be not be petty. But that's not what modern politics is it? And has never really been. That's not what politics is about at all. So democracy for the left has also been kind of a disappointment, and for the liberals as well, because none of the experiments of democracy have resulted in what they wanted. For the communists, it hasn't resulted in an egalitarian and ennobled world. For the liberals, it hasn't resulted in freedom, something that the right would have told them anyway, which the right predicted before we got universal suffrage. And the left, and so on, and well, we don't really have communists anymore, of course. The communist experiment, as the really harsh ideological form of it, kind of was tried and failed in the Soviet Union and in North Korea and in Cambodia and so on. But we have neoliberal systems now, of course, a sort of capitalist system with socialist social values, Rousseauian values, and capitalism. And they are moving away from democracy. They're moving towards technocracy, the idea that basically ideas and concepts should be tried and tested by experts. Ruled by experts is really what technocracy is. It's what the experts say is the consensus, is the policy we should be implementing. We shouldn't concern ourselves with the opinion of the majority or with morality, simply with efficiency and expertise. That's technocracy. And it really is the model of the EU. And I'm specifically looking at the EU here. I'm, of course, a European, and I'm more interested in what happens in Europe. But this happens in the USA as well, in the Anglo-Saxon world. This move away from the democratic, ignoring the vote and rigging the vote, to get the technocratic solutions through. But we get more salient examples in Europe. You get your Brexit vote, where there's democracy, and if you are an idealist and you believe democracy is a good system, and you believe the will of the people should be followed, as many liberals, classical liberals, like quite a few people still are classical liberals because that's the values they were raised with, but it's not what the elite is. They are not classical liberals; they're neoliberals, and these classical liberals still hold democracy up as a sort of ideal, but that's not really how things work. So Brexit vote, it gets voted. Democracy says we're doing Brexit, and the system says, well, no, because that's not in line with what we've tabulated to be the optimal policy. Globalism is the optimal policy for trade, so we're not doing Brexit. The same thing happened in 2005 when the Dutch and the French voted against the EU constitution, which 2 years later was simply passed as a Lisbon Treaty. And whenever anyone is pulled, of course, this idea of ever closer union in the EU, no one likes it. It's always said, no, that's a bad part of the EU. Like, even the pro-EU people don't necessarily want a federalized Europe. They're like, yeah, the trade deals are good and so on. But, the technocracy has determined that the optimal policy, in terms of geopolitics, to oppose Russia and the US, in terms of trade agreements, it's a federalized Europe. So that's what they're going to do. And they will sweep aside democratic votes because the democratic votes don't matter. It's turned out that the general populace isn't as enlightened as they'd like them to be. They're nationalist, they're petty, they put their own interest above the geopolitical interests of the Union. And we simply cannot have that as an EU. So this pretense of democracy and liberalism is really a pretense. It's a carrot they put before the mass horde that has been indoctrinated in these values until they can indoctrinate again the next generation in more technocratic and radical values, as we're seeing now at universities, of course, that you're not being taught classical liberal values, you're being taught these cultural Marxist ideas, these social justice ideas, and so on. Really, it's interesting how much you can steer society from the top down in these sorts of terms, really. But yeah, that's kind of the point I want to make, that basically everyone at this point has realized that democracy doesn't really work for their purposes. That the elites, the neoliberal elites, don't want democracy because democracy is just a bit of a nuisance that constantly goes against what they want. And the right has always criticized democracy for being mob rule. Republicans want elitist systems, aristocrats, monarchists have their own systems, of course. These are just kind of observations. Democracy is kind of dying as an ideal. No one really considers it as an ideal anymore. Quite a lot of these really radical leftists, I don't think, are motivated by any genuine actual ideals. They are motivated mainly by spite, and they don't do much deep thinking. When I speak to leftist people, far leftist, I mean by that, but even centrist leftists often don't read very much. But far leftists especially haven't read anything. If they've read anything, it's papers and study materials by their professors handed down to them. They've not actually gone down to the sources to read anything. They haven't read they haven't read actual Marxist works like Marx, like Lenin. They haven't read, for example, feminists these days. They have a very liberal conception of feminism. Just equality and rights and being allowed to be a degenerate and kind of be hedonistic. But ideological feminism isn't that at all. Ideological feminism isn't liberal. Ideological feminism wasn't hedonistic. Ideological feminism was misandric. It like the Scum Manifesto and these sorts of things. They weren't about free abortions and like the glass ceiling. They were about destroying the patriarchal system. They were about putting men in camps and milking them for sperm and reducing them to second-class citizens. Feminism was bloody radical in the 70s. And I know this because I actually have a mother who was quite, well, not sure she was a feminist herself, but she read that literature, and I read that literature when I was young. That's kind of, I grew up in a very, very far left household, so I read all of this extremely far left literature, and it influenced me for a while. This extreme feminist literature, like The Mists of Avalon by this what's her name? Some feminist woman who reinterprets the entire Arthur myth as the women being the ones holding power and the men being nothing but sexual toys and like pawns to use in the power plays. It's yeah, modern feminism is liberalized. All of these radical ideas on the left have been completely co-opted and liberalized. Um, and none of it's idealistic anymore. None of it holds like higher ideals. It's all sort of hedonistic, individualized, consumption oriented, spur of the moment kind of thing. There isn't much ideology, there isn't much thinking behind it. The same goes for the right, of course. And I mean, neoconservatives, neoliberals. What kind of literature or thinking can you find from them? At least Marxists had really ideas were very important to Marxists. They were constantly engaging in dialectic, in self-criticism, in criticizing their own theory, deconstructing it, and building it back up. Um, Marxism, I think, was attractive to intellectuals for quite a long time because it allows you to play a lot of intellectual games. So therefore, it's quite interesting to sort of do think games and thinking competitions and out criticize and outwit and out argument each other within this dialectic of communism and Marxism. But there's no modern systems that does that. There's no deep thinking in any modern system. Which I think is why a lot of people are turning back to far-right ideas, because quite a lot of far-right ideas are based in tradition and so on. And even though quite a lot of it isn't as deep as you might on surface think, it's something to it, and it has substance and experience behind it. But anyway, I'm going a little bit past the point of democracy. I think democracy is a we are living in a system that's only democratic in name. There's no real democracy anymore. It's a technocracy, an oligarchy of sorts, corporatist sort of system where the bureaucrat class and the business class rule, and they determine and set the policy, and they're the elite. Now, I don't really necessarily have a problem with the elite setting policy, but an elite should be national. An elite should be setting policies for the benefit of the people, and be this concept of noblesse oblige, noblesse obligée. The nobility has a duty to serve the lower classes and not uplift them, but take care of their needs and make sure that their destiny is tied to theirs, and therefore, as a whole society, you go forward. And of course, this neoliberal order has absolutely no care for the little man. The middle class is there to be milked. The little man is there to do the labor. And if he doesn't do it, or he complains too much, he will be replaced by an immigrant, because everyone is interchangeable now. And democracy. The little man and the middle class, they whine too much, they vote contrary to the policy. Well, what power do they have anyway? They're not willing to go onto the streets, they're not willing to commit to violence, to do anything about their own interests. Well then, bloody well, why should we care? We'll replace them and make sure they don't complain as much. But they'll have its own problems eventually. I don't think Islam will really go along with the technocracy either. But they'll see that in due time, and maybe they'll be able to deal with that. It's kind of a bit of a random stream of thoughts about a bit of the modern world.